Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to take a look at a game in the Budapest, but unlike the one we looked at 2 or 3 weeks ago, this time it's going to be white who comes out victorious. And it looks like, excuse me, it looks like this game is really, putting the question to this whole approach where black plays with this rook lift. So you might remember in the game that I looked at a couple of weeks ago, I showed one of my own games in the notes. It was a game that I won very quickly against Bizgeyer in a rapid event with this a5, rook a6, rook h6 attacking business. Well, there was a game played last year between Glenn Fleer and a weaker player named Tadai, 23-14. So not a bad player certainly, but not a peer of Fleer's. Fleer's been a grandmaster for many years now. But it looks like this is just good analysis, and it's analysis that has been confirmed by some other sources as well as being strong. So I thought I'd we'll take a quick look at this game and give a little bit of an overview of the analysis that's out there. Maybe throw in one quick little idea of my own, which also I've refuted. And this is something that Budapest players should know about, and it's maybe a pretty good reason to look for other openings, at least if this is your main line. Okay, so here's how we get there. Okay, so the knight to g4 line, and then white plays knight f3. So there are alternatives for both sides before that. There's knight e4, which I don't think is very good after a3 and queen c2. That's a3 followed by queen c2. And bishop to f4 is certainly playable. The g5 lines are actually pretty interesting against that. Certainly the other, the old-fashioned moves with bishop to b4 check or knight c6 first, and then bishop to b4 check, are certainly fine for white as well. But they're fine for white. Black's not in terrible shape, but maybe g5 is as I said, the most dynamic approach there. So knight f3 sidesteps that. But this has been thought to be kind of dangerous, practically speaking, for white on account of this Dreimer rook lift. Dreimer being the player who came up with it, and it's Moskalenko in his book, the what does he call it? The Fabulous Dutch, or sorry, not the Fabulous Dutch, the Fabulous Budapest Gambit, who popularized or gave Dreimer the due credit for that. Anyway, so here's how we get there: e3, knight c6, knight c3, castles, bishop e2. Okay, and this game was knight c takes e5. I remember a long time ago reading that maybe knight g takes e5 is more accurate, but be that as it may, it'll often just transpose. Let me take a quick look here. Yeah, I don't know if there's any big difference, but anyway, knight e5, castles, rook e8. Now here in my game with Bizgeyer played a3, which is really pretty bad. And the reason is that it's bad on a number of grounds. One is that it just wasted tempo, but secondly, when black plays a5, it looks, from white's point of view, if white's not familiar with this line, and if white is familiar with this line, he wouldn't have played a3. It looks like a5 is just designed to stop b4. So white feels very confident and continues with b3. And now rook a6, and bad news. And as you may recall in that game, the rook goes to h6, the queen goes to h4, and on h3 you just play d6, and you're threatening bishop takes h3. And a massacre can very easily ensue, and in fact that's what did happen in the game that I mentioned. So the better move is b3. And here black has a number of choices. I mean, he can play d6, which might be the best way to go, really, in this position, objectively speaking. And you might want to take a look at Stefan Bucher's column for this month. So it's his June 23rd column. Let me make a quick fix here in my notes. Yeah, June 23, 2010, his column on the Chess Cafe website. So he addresses some analysis of Avruks and also of Kirill Georgiev in his book, Squeezing the Gambits, which just came out earlier this year. It's a pretty nice book. He, let me pull it up here. He looks at the Benko, the Budapest, the Alban, and the Blumenfeld. I would say about almost 2/3 of the book is on the Benko Gambit, but certainly all of these openings get their fair share of coverage. So it's a nice little book, about 190 pages. And anyway, you can see his analysis there. As I said, Bucher tries to shore it up for black a little bit against Georgiev and Avruk in his 1d4 book, Volume 2. Also a great book. Well, definitely that's the best book. I mean, the Georgiev book is very good, but it's dealing with a much more limited range of openings, whereas the Avrukh book is trying to deal with a whole ton of main lines between that and the first volume. They're indispensable for strong players who play 1d4. So if you're an expert or a master and up and you play 1d4, those are books you absolutely ought to have. If you're lower than that, no, I think they're too advanced, because they're not really trying to be instructional. They're just trying to give you a fantastic, very high-level repertoire, but without a great deal of explanation. At least explanation for a less experienced player. Okay, anyway, all this to say that d6 is probably, or maybe the safest way to go here, maybe the best way to go. But a5 is the really fun stuff. I mean, this is why people play the Budapest, is to get this rook lift. The rook goes to a6, h6, queen h4, and black just throws the kitchen sink at white's king and hopes something is going to stick. And, why not? I mean, it looks like it should be pretty reasonable. I mean, white doesn't have such active pieces. He's missing many kingside defenders. I mean, there's just the bishop on e2. Doesn't have a knight on f3. So it looks like the preconditions for a successful attack ought to be in place, or at least for a reasonable attack. But as we'll see, it's really not so easy for black. Not as easy as it might seem. Okay, well, bishop to b2, just kind of minding his own business for the moment. Rook a6, here he comes. And now a very specific sequence, which I think is also recommended by Avrukh. I forgot to double check and see what he says, but I know he recommends queen d5 at some moment too. So here it is at this point, queen d5. And this was played by Fleer and recommended, I think, by Avrukh, and definitely recommended by Georgiev. Okay, now here black has several moves that he can choose between. There's queen e7, which, or no, not queen e7 here, I think it's somewhere else. Queen e7 is at best just kind of delaying the question. I mean, the bishop is still kind of loose there, and the queen on e7 can't go to h4 with the bishop loose. So two main moves here, bishop to a7 and bishop to f8. Now, bishop to f8 is probably the better move, according to both Georgiev and van der Tak in the current New in Chess yearbook. That's issue 95 at this moment. But if you play that, then you're not going to get your Dreimer fantasy anymore. So here's a sample line that Georgiev gives, which van der Tak also basically approves of. And they essentially agree. It's just a question of how serious it is. So knight e4, rook a to e6. Okay, the knight has to be protected, but where can you move the knight that's going to let the rook go from a6 to h6? So nowhere. If you play f6, the rook's cut off. If you play d6, the rook's cut off. If you move the knight back to g6 or c6, same thing. So rook a to e6 is hoping that black will have time, so he can kick the queen away and then bring the rook over to h6. But this plan's just not going to work. So c5, c6, queen d4. I suppose black could play rook to h6 now, but you can just see that he doesn't have enough space really to make any of this work. And so better is for him to switch gears here with knight to c4, give his pieces a little bit of room. So queen c4, rook e4, and then d5. So this gives black enough room, enough space for his pieces, and white's just a little bit better in this position. Okay, so this is where Georgiev leaves off. Van der Tak kind of strangely looks at this position. He's quoting Georgiev the whole time, but acts as if Georgiev stopped here, and then he mentions bishop to c3, which is probably also okay. Anyway, in this position, white's a little bit better. So he's got a little bit more space. Certainly the bishop on b2 is the best bishop on the board. Black's heavy pieces are triple on the e-file, but rook e3 is just not going to work. At least it shouldn't work. So white is really in perfectly good shape at this point. So black, certainly not losing or anything, but white is a little bit more comfortable. And black really, again, if white doesn't fall for some trick with rook e3 or something like that, black is going to have virtually no winning chances in a position like this at all. It's just very passive. His majority is going to be very difficult to advance, while white's majority, if it can get rolling a little bit, will grab a nice share of the center and perhaps cramp black's position a bit. So you can play like this with black and maybe roll the dice If the guy doesn't play 12 queen to d5, then you can get your Dreimer attack, and if he does, well, you play this, and you grovel for a bit and try to draw. All right, so that's one line. Second line that I decided to try out with the computer was to see, well, what happens if black just ignores white's threat and just plays rook to h6. So it's losing, but there are a couple of lines where it can be a little tricky. So queen takes c5 is the only move that makes any sense. Queen h4. Now, if white tries to just make an exit square, this is no good. Black gets an immediate draw and can even win if white plays for more. So this is perpetual if king to g1, and if g3, black wins. So see if you can figure out how black is winning from this position. So I'll make you guys do a little work here. Okay, well, it's not so complicated. There's no mate, at least as far as I'm aware, but there is queen to h2 check, followed by knight to d3. And the key point is, okay, of course, it's a knight fork winning the queen unless white takes, but then queen takes b2 is a new fork, after which black is going to end up at least a pawn ahead with a big positional advantage. So black is just winning here. So going back, f4 is no good. h3 is forced. Okay, now if d6 here, this just doesn't really pan out because of queen to d4. Okay, so we're threatening the queen, so black doesn't have time to play bishop takes h3. If he did, then he'd be in good shape, but he doesn't. So instead, black should probably play rook to g6. And now, again, white needs to be a little bit careful. If he plays king to h1, then something bad happens to him. Rook takes g2. Okay, the threat's queen takes h3 mate. The only reasonable reply is to take. But now d6, and we've got a double attack on the h3 pawn. And of course we're attacking the queen. So queen d4, check, here, rook e6, standard operating procedure, threatening rook to g6 with, well, maybe it's not an immediate forced mate, but just wins the house, and pretty much is a mate too. So queen e4 is forced, but the problem is, even after white returns some material, he's doing fine as far as material goes. He's got two rooks and a bishop for a queen and two pawns, but his king's position is still too open. And as we'll see, black is winning here. So for instance, after knight to d5, hoping to cover up with knight f4, as well as to just take the bishop if permitted, then knight to g4. Okay, threatening queen h2 mate. Of course, if the rook moves, then queen h2 and queen takes f2 is mate, or queen h2 and queen h1. So he's got to take, and then check. Here, queen h4 check, leaving the h3 square available in some cases. King g1, bishop to g4. And also, of course, the important point is that knight f4 won't attack the queen here. So if the queen were on h3, it would. So if knight f4 in this position, just bishop to f3, threatening mate. I guess I can demonstrate this. Threatening queen h1 mate. And on knight g2, well, you could still play queen h3 or simpler queen to g4. Or queen g5 even. So all of these are mating. So f3 is probably the best, but, well, all the moves are bad, so there is no real best move here. And black is just winning. So if you just look at the pieces, the count, it seems like it's good, again, good for white, but he's losing more material here quite rapidly. So this is hopeless for white. So after rook to g6, king h1 is bad. Queen to d5, I think, is actually pretty simple. So this looks like the practical move, and probably objectively speaking, the best move. So queen takes h3, just g3, and the queen comes into the defensive structure with queen g2. And after something like this, all right, white's a little bit boxed up, but he's up a piece for a pawn, and the attack is more or less over. White will follow up with moves like knight to d5, followed by knight f4, and it's hard to see how black can construct anything very dangerous at all. Okay, so queen d5 I think is really pretty good. But another move that's good but quite dangerous is knight to d5. So here the play gets very sharp. So knight to d5 has as its point knight to f4, and that would be the rejoinder in case of queen h3. So queen h3, knight f4 would just win. Okay. But d6 is actually kind of lively. So on queen d4, again, not queen takes h3, knight f4, hitting the queen and the rook, but rook takes g2 check. King g2, bishop h3 check. Okay, now, not king to g1, of course, because queen to g5 is winning. So white has to play king h2, not fearing the discovered check. Okay, so bishop to g4. And now, of course, not king to g2, because then check, and bishop f3 wins, threatening mate on g2 or h1, and if bishop f3, knight takes f3 is mate. So king g1 is forced, now rook e6. So all very exciting. The rook is not only planning to go to h6, but to g6 as well, and both create serious threats. So white's best is rook f to d1. Maybe he can play rook f to c1 as well, but that doesn't make any sense. So rook f to d1, rook to g6, and now knight e7 check. So terrific move, and this is what saves white's life. Is this move? Okay. Also, if rook h6, let me see if I can figure this out. If rook h6, well, probably queen to e4, and on queen h2, king f1, bishop h3. Come on. King e1, and the king gets out. And that's why the rook has to go at least as far as d1. So this is a winning approach for white as well. So rook g6, knight e7 takes, king f1, getting out of the way of the discovery and protecting the bishop on e2. Okay, now if queen back to h4, then we just take. And the king has e2 as a flight square now. And on knight g4, queen f4, f2 is covered, and it also discovers the bishop's protection of f6, so there's no rook f6 to worry about. The queen is protected, so there's no knight h2 to worry about. And finally, white has everything under control and is winning. Okay, one other try for black is knight f3. But on this, bishop f3, and now queen f4 is very good. So getting rid of this dangerous bishop on f3 gives back a little material, sure. But after this exchange, white is up a piece for 2 pawns, and the pawns don't really matter here. So white is simply winning in this position. Okay, takes some time before we can maybe force resignation, but black's attack is at an end, and it's just a matter of technique from this point. Okay, so all this goes to show then that rook h6, while fun and maybe worth playing in the occasional blitz game, is ultimately not going to cut it. All right, so we can say then, I think, that bishop to f8 is perhaps the best move here, but white gets a kind of a boring but very safe edge, and black has almost no winning chances in this position. And the piece sack with rook h6 loses, but it's at least a little bit of fun for blitz. But objectively, it's just no good. All right, but let's look at bishop to a7. I mean, this is really the Dreimer move. So we keep the bishop on the hot diagonal, so that if f4, there's always bishop takes e3 check. Well, here comes the second important move by white, c5. So we shut this bishop out, and we're attacking the rook on a6. Okay, well here, black can perhaps improve with rook a to e6 or rook to g6, although white's better in both cases. So just to give the main lines in each case, if rook a to e6, f4, okay, the knight has to go to c6, knight to b5, hitting the bishop and hitting c7 in case of queen h4. And on rook takes e3, bishop c4, hitting f7, queen e7, okay, doubling up on the c pawn, so we take, and now bishop to d4. And I mean, you can see that although black is up a pawn, white's bishops are just spectacular here, and white has a big advantage according to Georgiev. So this seems to be right. Okay, line 2, rook to g6. So again, this is an improvement, but still, after f4, knight to g4, f5, rook g5, takes, h3, c6, queen d6, rook to b4, knight a4, f6, and bishop to d4, as given by Georgiev. White's only slightly better according to the computer, and that's what Georgiev says as well, but Black's position does look pretty ridiculous. So it's very strange. It's hard to believe that white can only be a little bit better here. And I suspect maybe with a few accurate moves in a row, that evaluation will shift. Maybe something other than f6 could be played here. I don't know, but anyway, this is definitely visually a horrifying position for black. But maybe the burden of white's actually winning the game as opposed to just sitting on black is kind of tough. Anyway, rook to g6 clearly isn't leading to anything magnificent in that variation. All right, so there's rook to h6, and now in Moskalenko's book, if you have that, you're relying on that as a Budapest fan. He only gives knight to e4, and this works beautifully for black. After c6, queen d4, d5, taking advantage of this pin. C takes d6, bishop takes queen. So knight to g3, and then b6. And yeah, now black is doing great. This was a game Polivodin against Mises from Moscow 92. Not Mises, the old grandmaster from the first half of the 20th century, but Normundus Mises, the Latvian GM. And black is doing well here, and I think he went on to win this game too. Yeah. But instead of knight to e4, here comes the third key move in a row. So for white, we start with queen d5, c5, and now f4. So we kick him again. Now, if black goes crazy with queen h4 here, there's a nifty refutation. So fe5, queen h2, king f2, rook e5. And all of a sudden, this looks really attractive for black. We're hitting the queen. We're going to take on c5, and then after that, e3 falls. Maybe rook f6 is coming. But all of this delightful possibility is going to become counterfactual after rook h1. So this really this kicks the stuffing out of black. Takes the wind out of his sails. Pick your metaphor. So after rook takes d5, rook h2, what does black do? So he can't win a rook here. So the rook on d5 is hanging, and if rook f5, king g1. Georgiev gives rook takes h2, king h2, bishop c5, and then bishop to f3. And even though black has 3 pawns here and can maybe win a fourth, though I'm not sure about that. Yeah, he really can't, because I think if bishop e3, then rook e1 is going to be decisive with the back rank problems. I mean, if rook to e5, what do we do then? So we've got to be careful about bishop to f4, discovered check, hitting the rook. Well, just knight e4, I think, is sufficient. So we're hitting the rook, and we're hitting the bishop. And, okay, if rook e6, rook e3, d5, does this work? No, because a rook to d3. So there we go. So black can't play bishop takes e3. And if you can't do that, then white should just be much better here. So black has 3 pawns for the piece, but the pawns aren't really a factor. I mean, black has no passers. His bishop on c8 is, well, it's going to take it a couple of moves to get into the game. And white's just in very, very good shape here. So this line is not to be played. Instead of rook takes h2, black could try bishop c5. This looks initially more appealing, but after taking here and then bishop to f3, again, it looks like white's just clearly better. Again, black has, well, this time black has even 4 pawns for the piece, but again, black's coordination is not very good. His back rank is a bit weak, and again, white is better. But you know, you might try to work on this line and see if you can figure out some ways where if white doesn't play accurately, black can be okay. Anyway, queen h4 I think is not ultimately working, but maybe you can investigate that ending and try to prove that it's not as bad as I'm suggesting. Anyway, knight to c6 was played against Fleer, and then knight to b5. And okay, queen h4 was played in a correspondence game. And again, it looks really exciting. It looks like black is getting close, but he's not. So h3, rook takes e3, bishop g4, protecting h3, so not allowing any of these sacrifices there. Bishop to b8. And here Georgiev gives queen to d2, which is very good. But even better is queen to g5, which is played in the correspondence game. Okay, threatening checkmate on g7. So takes, rook h4. Pretty ridiculous post. So rook a to e1, takes. Okay, threatening mate. So king f8, g3, goodbye rook. And okay, black's bishops came to life slightly after d6, but after this exchange, black is just in poor shape, and white went on to win the ending without too much difficulty in a game Ojeda against Pertsa, correspondence 2004. All right, so queen h4 doesn't work either. Okay, queen e7. So this looks good, at least initially. We're threatening c5. We're threatening e3. So doesn't something have to give? Well, sort of. Knight a7, queen e3 check, rook f2, knight a7, bishop c4. So black is up a pawn. This is correct. But his attack is over, and his bishop on c8 is still at home. The knight on a7 looks ridiculous, and this bishop on b2 is just dazzlingly powerful. All right. If queen to e7, then f5 threatening f6 is very strong. White's much better here. And on rook e7, here Fleer points out an even better move than what he played. So he played bishop to d4, which certainly isn't bad, but even better was f5. And there's a trick. So the idea, of course, is again to play f6. And the trick is that on rook takes h2, white is something very strong here. So see if you can figure out what Fleer missed, though he pointed it out later in his notes. Really a beautiful idea. Well, it starts with f6, and this is a pretty straightforward and obvious move. So the question is, well, what about queen to h6? So that's the sneaky idea, threatening rook to h1. So if you didn't see queen h6, then you don't get credit for f6, because this is really the key line. Well, here's the big one. Queen takes f7. That just wins. Okay, if the king moves, queen g8 is mate, or queen f8. And on rook takes f7, bishop f7. What does black do? If he wants to try to keep his queen on the board and not just return the material and be hopelessly lost, he should take and then try king e7, so that there's no queen with check. But bad news. Rook to e1 check, and black has no good moves anymore. If the king retreats, then rook f8 or g8, queen is mate. And if queen e6, well, we take that, then we take the rook, and then we make a queen. Horrible. Okay, so f5 would have been really fantastic, but bishop to d4 was certainly very good. Queen e4. Here Georgiev suggests the best move would have been to trade and play bishop to e5. And as Georgiev puts it, or at least as the translator put it from Georgiev, the raving bishops rule over the board. And that's just about right here. Okay, so in the game he played f5, and here maybe Georgiev suggested if he traded and played this position, he would have more chances to survive. Although even here, it's pretty much visually apparent that black's position is fairly lousy. All right, well, in the game he played c6, and now takes, bishop c3. And black is up a pawn, yes, but look at these pieces. I mean, they're horrifying. The rook on h6, right? So the famous Dreimer rook, this is its fate, to just be shunted off to the side of the board with no prospects at all. The bishop on c8 is undeveloped. The knight on a7 is lousy too. So black played d5 here, trying to activate, of course, as best as he can. But bishop to d3, rook e8, rook e1. So a very good move. And this would have been the reply to rook e3 as well. So we trade off the only active black piece here. So takes, king f8, and now what should white do here? Well, the answer is simply a4. So we keep this knight stuck out of play. So this guy is not getting anywhere. Okay, black played bishop to d7, developing and hoping maybe to play knight c8, e7, and maybe then from there to g6 to f6, g8 to f6. And then finally it's developed, though the rook on h6 will still be pretty lousy. Okay, g3. And the point of this is that white is creating a cage around the black rook. So as Georgiev puts it, the Dreimer rook is railed off and awaiting to be eaten by white's bishop. Okay, fine work of translation, but nevertheless, the rather amusing way of putting it is just completely correct. Okay, knight c8. White grabs this pawn before coming back for the main meal. f6, king g2. Okay, this is important because White's going to play g4 at some point, and in response to rook h4, he can play king g3. So king f7, bishop d2, rook h5, g4. There it is. And if rook h4, king g3. And it's nice that Black played king f7 because now after g5, when he takes en passant, it's with check. So that would just win the rook straight away. So Black played rook to g5, but this is hopeless. Takes. And now Fleer finishes very quickly and powerfully. b4, b5, b6. Okay, and so finally the Black Knight has found it's found something meaningful to do. But now it would have been better on the other side of the board. So a5, and White's just going to play a6 and make a new queen. So if knight g4, a6, and a pawn is promoting. So Black played bishop to c8. White just plays rook to a2, and again, the queen side is going to produce either a new queen or at least win all of Black's pieces. So Tadai resigned here. Okay, so that will conclude our little presentation here on what's new in the Budapest, and this is where the action is. I mean, it really looks like this Dreimer rook lift idea is just not working. It's not happening if White plays this system with queen d5 followed by c5 and then f4. So this is really causing Black some pain. So you just play like this, and it's just bad news. So I mean, it's funny, you know, we looked at this position right over here, and White's king side just looks ripe for the picking, and Black's pieces all look much more active. But just look what happens several moves later. I mean, it's just kind of really a compelling shift, right? All of a sudden, it's White's pieces that are just dominating the center of the board, much more space, active pieces. Black's whole army looks entirely uncoordinated here. So beware, those of you who like this, and that includes me. I mean, I've used this, certainly not my main opening against strong players, but I've used it off and on for many years, but at this point it looks really just unsatisfactory. So you can play it in the occasional blitz game, but unless you can find some serious improvements, at least this rook lift idea is just out the window. All right, thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed it, and next time I'm sure we'll do something a little bit less theoretical. Anyway, take care, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.